I don't even know what they could be. But whatever they are, we know that very delicate balance is very delicate. It's the balance within the cell, within the person. And we already know that, there are some genes that if they mutate, they cause all kinds of horrible phenotypes for diseases that we would never predict, knowing what the function of the gene product is. And I guess the best known is Lesch-Nyhan disease, which is, I forgot with the gene, but it's a gene that does a very minor metabolic pathway. But if that gene is mutated, you end up with one of the worst genetic diseases, I don't even want to describe it, that anyone has ever had. And nobody knows why, because there's so much complexity in the way genes interact and their gene products interact, that it's not predictable. Will we ever get to the point where we can understand all that? I don't know. But we're very far from it now.
Right. So you raise an interesting worry. And I think most critics of genetic enhancement are really worried about this, that people will just start having this strong optimism of curing all kinds of diseases, making humans smart, intelligent, tall, whatever, strong. Perhaps what they didn't have in their childhood, their own. Perhaps they wanted to be stronger. They didn't want to be in bed, sick all the time. They just said, well, I think if I have children, then they should be better off. I don't want my children to have all these diseases, right? But optimism is not necessarily a bad thing if you're not blind to all these complications you just mentioned. So we need to do lots of research to really determine, well, this genetic alteration is expected to make life go better. But even then, this is a probability calculation, right? And we could be wrong. So you said it's irreversible. To some extent, it is, because you certainly can't change it in this generation anymore. But if you have new data, new evidence that whatever we did turns out to be actually really bad, to actually have a lot of unforeseen consequences, which make the lives of thousands of people perhaps much worse, well, in the next generation you can do better, because you can reverse the change. And this can happen. It's not impossible. And I think to raise this issue that we should make it impossible for something like this to happen is too strong of a requirement. Because in that case, we couldn't use genetic engineering ever, because there might always be unforeseen consequences.
Right.
Okay.
I think it's kind of a good time.
This is fascinating.
Yeah, I love this topic.
Absolutely fascinating.
We do have some actual questions that are really spot on what you guys are just talking about. So maybe kind of ask some of them now. One of them specifically, if you can kind of address this, one way that you can actually change the way things go through a population is called a gene drive. And gene drives can basically eliminate certain things like malaria by changing the way another species like the whatever the virus is for the mosquito carriers. I can't remember the name of the actual what's the name of it? Ever remember?
Malaria?
Yeah, no, but the actual organism that causes that. I can't remember off the top of my head. But you can use a gene drive to actually change the propagation of genes through the entire species. Can you use something like that, or can I describe to the audience how gene drive would actually work to do that? And it ties into another question: should we use that on evasive species like mosquitoes, or you had mentioned hyacinth? There's actually another one, giant hogworth, that has been invading Canada, and giant hogweed is actually poisonous, and if you get on your skin, it can cause third-degree burns. Should we use these kinds of technologies to eliminate these kind of invasive species, or are there ethical considerations to be had for that?
Walter wants to take that.
Yeah. Do you want to take that, Walter?
I'll let you take.
Okay, well, I think that's fine. I think that's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with gene drive, and I know the work you're talking about. What happens is with the gene drive is you you're doing the same thing on the mosquito. You're altering the germline genetics so that all the children of the mosquito have this change, and the change could be just something simple that doesn't allow the pathogen to reproduce within the mosquito. So it doesn't hurt the mosquito, which you don't want to do. The last thing you want to do is eliminate mosquitoes, because then we lose all our birds. That's what I mean by unforeseen consequences. So you don't want to get rid of mosquitoes. You want to keep them, but you don't want them to pass on the disease. So I think that's a great idea. And and in fact, the reason that comes up is because that's pretty close to being done. There are people very close to being able to put that into the field in Africa.
I think they've already started in some places.
Yeah, it started, and well, I didn't know that, but anyway.
I think that's some. I'm going to look into that. Maybe the audience could talk about that. But I think that in some places they've actually tried to do something along those lines. This stuff is happening. Yeah, this stuff is happening so fast that nobody can keep up with that. So, but yeah, I have nothing against that. I think that, but you see, that's where you have to be. That's where this whole idea of caution, which I think we agree on, is Walter just said, you have to do research to make sure you're not doing something that's going to bounce back and bite you. And the whole idea, for example, of putting in genes that reduce the fertility of mosquitoes, which is one option that people used to talk about, could be dangerous, because if you wipe out all mosquitoes, you're stopping the gene
the
drive
food chain
tries not to do that.
Animals.
Yeah, the gene drive tries not to reduce reproduction.
That's right. That's right, and that's why these technologies are ultimately good. I'm not against the technologies at all. I mean, I've been in favor of recombinant DNA since the 70s, when the whole thing first came up, and I was so there's nothing wrong with recombinant DNA. Thing?
Oh yeah, we have the question on that one. I got to ask that question. By the way, the word I was looking for was plasmodium. I remember it now. I should have remembered plasmodium. That's it. We've talked about it before, but. That goes to the question that I was going to ask earlier, real quick, because a friend of mine had asked me to ask this to you guys. But is there a way to do gene editing so we can eat as much pizza as we want and not get fat? Because if there is, I am totally down for this. Yeah, I think, Walter, you might say yes, right?
Yeah, I was about to say, just to sell my idea, I'm going to say yes, whatever. But
awesome.
I think
that's how you do it. There you go.
There you go. He's got it.
Let's back it up with some evidence, right? So obesity is kind of the perhaps biggest disease after cancer we face nowadays. We didn't have that a few decades ago. It seems to be an epidemic which spreads through the whole population. Why is that? Well, we're quite ill-adapted to modern life. Well, also our food is really shit and unhealthy, right? But that doesn't really seem to change. You should obviously put some regulations on there. In Europe, we have very different laws than in America, what you can put on the plates of people to eat. I'm not sure that's going to happen in the US. I'm not from there.
No.
Never. Like my Big
in
Mac.
Germany, we have, right, the Big Mac. So what I sometimes do, when I was in Canada a few weeks ago for a conference. I tasted the Big Mac, and, well, it tastes different. Why? Because you do use different ingredients. So in Germany, you use this grass-fed beef, and it's kind of nice. It's still pretty unhealthy.
Yeah, they don't put beef in ours. I don't know what it is.
Yeah. I was going to say, when did they start doing that? That's a new thing.
Yeah, wait a minute.
Real quick, what are the things that you're talking about where you said that they control what you put on a plate? That's interesting. How do they work that? Like, what are the laws for that?
We have research, I guess, and plenty of ingredients that are put into processed foods. They are not yet evidence is tested that they're actually not harmful to humans. While there's a very different approach in the US, I guess, where if something is not proven to be harmful to humans, well, then you can sell it, right? But in the European Union, it's a bit different. So if there's something new, but you don't have studies on it, that it's actually not harmful to humans, then you can't just put it into the food of what people eat, right? And I think that seems to be a pretty reasonable idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. This next question, I think, really kind of goes into what Cy was talking about earlier, and I'll try to just kind of condense it down. Basically, the person wants to know, when dealing with certain things like gene complexes and you have various forms of gene linkages, how do you determine, based upon gene expressions, when you edit one gene, how it's going to affect countless other genes that we don't even know how they're interrelated? That seems to be a huge consideration factor, does it not?
Right. So a big worry is that if we can't test on humans, then how can we actually know what the differences are going to be? We often rely on twin studies for such issues, but that doesn't seem to be enough. And can we actually experiment on embryos? Can we actually do this morally to create a human as a test subject? Well, doesn't seem to be the case. We don't like experiments on humans for obvious moral reasons. So what do? Well, perhaps we can test on mice. And that seems to be working behind a lot of diseases. A lot of diseases that are caused in us are also the causes in mice and other mammals. And this is where the research has to go. And in many areas, like perhaps human intelligence, we can't learn that much from doing experiments on mice using CRISPR-Cas, which is a big concern. And perhaps we can never reach this goal of creating these perfect superhumans that are intelligent, brave, smart, super good looking. Perhaps we will only be able to get rid of diseases. But if that's the case, well, that's still a pretty good thing.
But I think the concern is, what about with gene mapping, such that you don't know what else you're changing? If you change one expression level of a gene and downregulate it, and you have a certain protein that's not being produced as much as a consequence as a specific gene being edited, how would you ever be able to predict that if you don't know how these genes are interrelated?
Right, you don't. And even if we learn something new about genes, then we didn't learn everything. And that's going to be the case for perhaps decades. And certainty is really not the goal here. So perhaps, so if you think about the evolution of homosexuality, for example, there's no theory that's very well confirmed why there's homosexuality, because according to evolution, doesn't seem to be the most reasonable strategy for an organism, right? However, one theory is that some particular gene combined with the modern environment we live in causes this. Well, that's one hypothesis, and we don't know. And in many cases, there might be unforeseen consequences. But that's just the issue we have to deal with. It's complicated research, and there's a lot of funding has to go into that, just because the advantages are enormous, even if it's very, very difficult to define what would count as a genetic enhancement in the end.
You know,
I can answer that question for you. Yeah, sure. But let me answer the question about why the homosexual gene came about. Because the world needed a little bit of fabulousness. I can attest to this.
Right.
Go ahead, Cy.
No, I mean, I think that the example of homosexuality is actually a serious one when it comes to looking at environment, especially social environment. So when I was a kid, which is a long time ago, but not that long ago, we're talking about the 1950s, homosexuality was considered either a sin, a vice, or at best a disease. And I'm talking about very liberal people still believed that homosexuals should not be killed, but they should be treated. Okay? We don't have that belief anymore. I think if we ask homosexuals, do you think you want to be cured of your homosexuality? No. That's laughable, right? They would say no, because it's not a disease. So the point that I'm making is, you know, the environment includes the social, political, whatever you want to call it, current environment of the way people think about all kinds of things, including sexuality